One of our body actors, Everglade, would sometimes just stop moving and just like AFK, and he'll be like, where'd she go? And she would come back in like 10 or 15 minutes later with a brand new skin she just created. And we'd be like, that's amazing. We all start crowding around looking at this skin she just made in 15 minutes. And then it would end up being the main skin that would be featured in a scene like later down the line because it was so good.
So despite the challenge of having to get a lot of shots done, there was actually a pretty casual atmosphere on the set, and it ended up being a lot of fun. There was a lot of inside jokes and things of that nature. For example, one character in particular got a lot of attention amongst the cast and crew that wasn't really of much note when the series finally aired, and that is
Grunt, Grunt, Grunt!
Grunt pretty much existed for the sole purpose of providing an extra death on Gamma Team at the beginning, but he had quite a following amongst the cast and crew, and people kind of treated him as this Boba Fett kind of figure that has very little screen time, but has this whole complex backstory that everyone assigned to them in this sort of headcanon. One particular actor really took to him and pretty much body acted for him in every scene that he was in, and during the building process, he actually managed to include a little couple of Easter eggs to dear old Grunt that you could find about in the world, particularly in the markets of Centaurus near the bay. Also, we were really surprised by the dedication of some of our cast and crew. We worked with quite a few European members of the team. Despite how late we often shot, they were always there, readily available, even though their time zone was so far ahead. That was quite an interesting experience that ended up for some cultural clashes that consist of what we now call the European noises.
Yeah, just randomly, just a Q. Why? Because Q.
Because French, that's why.
Also, Fortzeta, I understand, but whatever.
Yeah, because he's German.
Nicht Fortzeta. That's not a word.
So this is something we knew that we would have to be doing a lot throughout the series because of the nature of the plot. But the first time we had to show a destroyed city was in the village of Prima. So what we would do, instead of just placing TNT everywhere and just letting it go and then showing it as is, we did use a lot of TNT in there, but we would go back in afterwards and start placing fires everywhere and start turning the smooth stone walls that would be unearthed from this explosion into cobblestone, having little stone buttons on the walls where the cobblestone was to kind of break it even more to make it look jagged as opposed to single blocks. A lot of hat slabs. We would use a lot of coarse dirt and a lot of blocks like that to make sure that grass didn't start growing back in. One of the creative challenges is making it still look like that city while it's in complete ruin. A lot of that just comes down to making sure that some base structures are still there and making sure that rubble is recognizable as buildings that had collapsed, using the same materials and all that good stuff.
So in episode 4 is a very unique episode in that it kinda is the first episode following the world-breaking event in episode 3. And so the whole custom sequence was kinda intentionally drawn out and awkward to try and put the audience into Vera's shoes of being in a strange foreign place. So then at the end of that episode, we also see the first large-scale attack on one of the cities in the form of what we call the Centaurus creeper bombings. So first of all, we wanted that sequence to have a downpour of rain to get an interesting atmosphere and color about everything. Part of that, though, involved some challenges on the set. For example, the city of Centaurus itself is actually on a pretty high elevation, which means after a certain point, that rain becomes snow. The streets were low enough so that snow wouldn't affect it, but if you look at the tops of some of the buildings, you may notice that we were pretty deliberately shooting to minimize the amount of snow you could see on screen.
So the Centaurus creeper bombings were actually really interesting because it was the first time we used motion metadata in our mobs. So the creepers that were running through the city didn't have any AI, but I would give them motion data so that they would just move and their feet would move on their own, I guess. And I would just have them on a track. I would just tell them to move in that direction and just keep moving because like most of the Centaurus streets were long straightaways. There's this part where it cuts away for a second, then it comes back and one creeper's still walking around the street, but the other creeper had hopped the fence and was walking towards some residential buildings. The creeper that was on the other side of the fence was an entirely separate creeper. While the camera turned away, one creeper I would just kill off and then summon another creeper with obviously the same data that would then act as if it had jumped the fence.
So an interesting challenge was the one where the two creepers that make it into the city are marching down, and that took a good few takes to get right because we had to time certain elements. First of all, that was one of the first big shots that we used Blockbuster for. It was about this time that we were starting to implement it regularly to establish a large crowd in a scene. And so we essentially set up a lot of these bodies to play out the scene and react to the path that we knew the creepers were going to take.
Normally with a lot of scenes that involve explosions, they're mostly fake. It's hard to get kind of the results you want with real explosions, but with those, since they're charged creepers, I could ramp up the charged creeper explosions to make them do a lot of damage in that area and have the actual creeper explosions in the shot, and then come back in afterwards and then beauty it up with the cobblestone and the buttons and the coarse dirt and the fire. And that's what we did at the embassy.
So episode 5 is one of the biggest inciting episodes, when the main cast of characters that we've all followed along separate paths up until this point finally start to come together. We knew from the start that the main party was going to consist of Anakor and Vera and Nim and Eric, and then we also wanted to have a sort of brains of the group that we didn't really establish during the first act, but definitely wanted to include because he serves a pretty important role, and that is Manon. And Manon was a character from the city of Pollux, and Pollux was essentially the technological capital of the world. And he is a scientist from Emerald University, which is actually the most prestigious university in the world. If you look at the interior of their facilities, you'll see that they have alchemy sets and very large lecture halls that we never actually show in the main series, but you could see if you download the world and search it yourself.
Oh, okay, so episode 6, there's a lot of stuff that happens in episode 6. First of all, there's ghasts all over the place. Obviously, there was a command that I had just kind of tucked away that I would just go to, and I would press the button to summon all the ghasts for the scene, press another one to kill them all. Easy reset, pretty typical stuff that we would do, and I just kind of had it tucked away, thinking nobody would touch it. I didn't really think about what would happen if somebody actually did find it and was like, hey, what's this button? And pressed it, which actually happened during one of our scenes. All of a sudden, and right above our heads, just these loud gasps. Like, we all just started freaking out, going like, ah! I had to fly up there and turn them off, get rid of them, and I was like, okay. If you see a button, don't press it unless I tell you what it is. And then I just grabbed the sign, slapped it down, and it says, do not press. And it's like, if it says do not press, don't press this button.
So we open episode 6 with essentially a montage of destruction and warfare as all of the Arcturians are battling Scourge's forces. And the interesting thing is that Arcturus is actually the hometown of the character Eric. Arcturus is essentially a city of battle-hardened warriors, hence Eric. And so we wanted to portray the Arcturians as being a very militaristic force and having these buff-looking soldiers fighting back against all of the mobs and being really the only city that manages to fight back a great deal. We also wanted to portray their combat aptitude by having them perform different sort of battle maneuvers. For example, throughout the opening montage, you see teams of Arcturians setting up TNT cannons in very short spans of time. You see a couple of Arcturian soldiers come out and take a formation and start fighting back. So it was a bunch of little things like that we sort of blocked out and choreographed to make the Arcturians look like really good fighters within a Minecraft context.
That was really hard to get because we had to get all of these people moving together in sync with each other and make it look like they had like practiced this before, which they actually did, because what we would do is I would go through with them and it's like, okay, here's how we're going to build a TNT cannon in the span of like 2 seconds using 3 different people doing different jobs. And getting everyone to move together in that kind of synchronicity took a lot of time.
So place the water and then back off and then place your button.
Oh yeah, so I do this, back off, place the button.
Exactly.
Okay.
In
This
3,
is a choreographed
2,
dance.
1, go.
Boom.
Yep, 5 seconds.
I feel like Lauren's like your drill sergeant, and you guys are like assembling a rifle right now together.
Yeah.
Even when we got it down, it didn't always work, either because the gases that were shooting at them would just mess them up and they wouldn't finish their part in time. And then of course the TNT would go off anyway and then just blow up the area. There was just a lot of little problems like that came with trying to get everybody moving together in basically a war zone.
And so we wanted long takes with lots of activity, and some of those provided quite a challenge. In fact, the 2 longest takes in this sequence both took us 9 tries to get right. And that was with the gas firing at the apartment buildings, and that one had quite a bit of cannon building choreography to it as well, and there were a number of things that could have gone wrong in that one, and did go wrong. And then there's also the long run of the main party of characters moving towards the police station. We actually had to shoot that scene at a higher frame rate in order to put it in slow motion, and that was a bit of a problem because with shaders and all the activity that's going on in this area, it actually bogs down my frame rate quite a bit. But for this part, we needed a lot more frames. So what I did was I lowered the render distance a great deal in order to increase the number of frames we're getting. Essentially, if I were to move beyond the area that we are looking at, you would notice that pretty much nothing else is loaded except for that one city block that we were shooting on.
So the sewer design in episode 6, the idea for that came from me and Raf's personal experience when it comes to Minecraft and how to get rid of our trash. And what I came up with was this lava system where there would just be a hole where we wanted to have our trash bin. So we would throw our trash into this little hole that would drop down into a water stream and be whisked away to a nearby block of lava to just be destroyed. So I was like, okay, I want to take that idea and turn it into a giant infrastructure for a city that you can walk through. And you can actually see in one of the shots items being dropped off from the water into the lava.
Now the sewers was a very interesting sequence because that was a good example of some of the organic storytelling that comes about when you're on a set. Essentially, when the body actors started trying to jump down and precisely land in the hole, it ended up having this interesting particle effect as the debris kind of fell in, and I kind of liked the look of it, and so I started making them very deliberately doing that for all the shots from that point onward.
We would just be messing around and somebody had the idea of going really high up, just like going in the hole, going straight up, and then just dropping right through the hole. Or Raph was saying, wait a minute, that looked kind of nice. We were like, wait, what happened? What did we do? And then somebody was like, oh, I fell through the hole from like 200 blocks up. We're like, what? I want to try that.
Replay mod, which is what we started using around this time to make our shooting lives easier, which essentially gives a theater mode to Minecraft where we could just play the session and then go back and record it to any extent that we want, and we could sort of play and fast forward. And this also allowed me to be a body actor in the scene, which was a huge help and a huge boon for all the episodes from this point onward when we really needed every hand on deck. So another organic thing that came about on set when we were shooting this scene was the creeper explosion behind Nim. Now that was actually completely accidental the first time it happened, but I thought it looked so cool and really intensified the moment in such a way that I had Lauren add the particles artificially to the start of her jump every time we redid it. Alright, so then at the end of this episode, the main party of characters fights their way up Kira Tower. Now this tower actually has a very interesting history that you might be able to hear more about if you watch the World of Edeneth side series. Now this was a very interesting challenge to shoot. We essentially really had to sell those numbers on the opening shot when we see the lobby area of Kira Tower. And it was definitely very troublesome actually getting those zombies to move in the way that we wanted them to. That was a good bit of mob wrangling we had to do because they couldn't actually see the party running past the door. So we essentially had to use a invisible villager trapped by barriers that gets summoned in right as the party passes by. And then we spawn in all of the zombies and then they start aggroing on that villager and start converging on the staircases, or so it seems. So it was around this time that Lauren actually started experimenting with structure blocks. Now these were very new to me. I wasn't sure what they're capable of, but Lauren used them to pretty fascinating effect in this action sequence. For example, that would have been a very difficult shot in most other circumstances because we would essentially have to destroy part of the environment and then reset the world to back up every time we wanted to redo the shot. But now thanks to structure blocks, instead the turnarounds for those kinds of shots were very brief, and we could essentially just press a button and reset it to what it used to be. And then of course at the very end of the episode, the team confronts Scourge for the very first time.
When Nim shoots Scourge with an arrow, the arrow should hit him in creative mode and just fall off. From the person's point of view who's getting shot, that happens. But for everybody else's point of view, they don't see the arrow. So I had to find a way to duplicate that effect using commands. So what I ended up doing was having an invisible barrier block appear in front of him, and then when Nem shoots the block, it would have a tag called in ground, and I would just have a command running to detect whenever there was an arrow that had the tag in ground, it would destroy the block. So it would hit the block would go away, and it would just fall.
And this was a sequence that we wanted to be absolutely epic and intense. So naturally, we threw a dragon into the mix. I had very specific shots in mind for this scene that were actually some of the first shots conceived. One such shot was when the dragon is dive bombing on the tower towards the party, and it was very interesting from a body acting perspective how we managed to accomplish that because, well, first of all, most of the characters in that particular shot were blockbuster models, and essentially how it worked was Lauren would put jump boost on me, and as the dragon is closing in, Lauren would give me a countdown, and then at a certain count I would start running backwards and then try and jump over the railing of the side of the roof. And that took a good few tries to get right, but then once we got it right and got it all synced up with the other blockbuster models that had repeated the same process, it had a very epic result. And I still remember the first time we saw the render of that slow motion shot in replay mod. Lauren was there next to me, and we just had this moment where we both just screamed with excitement.
Well, why it was one of my favorite to do is because I was piloting the dragon. What I would do was I would go into the pixel cam mod that we used to use for filming, for recording. What it would do is it would create a path that the player would go on that was supposed to be used for getting camera shots. But I discovered that if I can create a path that my character would use, I could teleport the dragon to me and have it be married to my path. So I can drive the dragon around. For some reason, I don't know why this is the case, but if you teleport a dragon to you, it's backwards. There's no precedent for that. It's the only time that happens. It was pretty funny because when I was actually doing those paths, I was doing those paths backwards.
Now, interestingly, there were actually 2 different endings that we shot for episode 6. We might have to release an alternate cut at some point. Looking back on the script, I realized what we'd shot didn't really match the emotional beat I was trying to hit of Eric saying goodbye to his home. We didn't linger on that long enough, so I essentially reshot parts of the ending to be able to accommodate this, so that way we can realize by the beginning of the next episode, when he is essentially sulking by the river, why exactly he's so distraught by this. So episode 7 was quite a return to the calmer form of the earlier episodes following the big mid-season climax of episode 6.
So when we see our heroes camping out in the middle of the forest, there is this little campfire that they would make. And if you look at the fire that's used, that's not a fire that you can get in a normal Minecraft. That isn't a block of fire. What it is a bunch of armor stands that are below the ground and kind of shoved into the block that are then caught on fire from lava from below. And I shouldn't really take credit for that campfire effect. Yeah, I learned it from a tutorial online, as most people do.
It's at this point that Manon essentially delivers an alternate objective. However, that did require them traveling into the Outlands. Now, the Outlands are essentially everything outside of the Kingdom of Edeneth. Edeneth is this little bubble in the world where essentially all is peaceful and all is calm. The Outlands are everything outside of that, where there's lawlessness. You can find out a little bit more about how that came to be if in some of the World of Edeneth episodes. So essentially, the further they venture into the Outlands, there's this sort of imposing sense of dread we wanted to build up. And the way we first meet that is with this bandit group. Now, the way this was shot was very interesting. First of all, this was on the set world. We essentially built this little forest area on flat land just to get this scene accomplished. And then we used the blockbuster to coordinate all of the characters in the scene. Now, this was easy for most of the characters because for a majority of the scene, most of them are standing still. However, for the characters that are actively involved in the scene and have all sorts of movement and blocking that they have to accomplish, this provided a huge challenge, especially since we were going through this basically in a theater style, as we like to call it, where we are going through it in one big long take and then getting the coverage that we need in replay mod afterwards.
So the scene when they're interacting with the bandit tribe and having to negotiate with the bandit leader to gain passage, that's actually the same set world that we used in a previous shot. First of all, I took the track, I just duplicated it over. We needed it to look different. We just grabbed the end of one of those tracks and just curved it around, changed all the tree types to the dark oak wood, and had those canopies where we could see the light shining through and have that effect of the shadows on the players, and it looked really nice. After Centaurus is blown up by the charged creepers, we actually return to that city. We actually get to see post-crisis Centaurus, and showing the renovation and the reconstruction of the city was really fun to do, because basically it would come down to doing what we do before in the cities and beautifying the destruction a bit. We would also add stuff to the outside of the buildings to make it look like there was scaffolding and construction.
And then in episode 8. Episode 8 was a very unique episode as well, because this is a sort of bottle episode for the main party of characters where they delve into this dungeon. And we wanted to give a very almost Indiana Jones vibe to it, but also a good bit of atmosphere where there's this enigma about it. This is a mysterious place.
So the Buried Temple was my baby. I spent a lot of time working on the Buried Temple, getting the lighting to look right and getting the atmosphere to look the way that it was presented in the script. But once we got to the actual chamber, getting the bridge to fall was something that I hadn't considered how it would actually do. Originally, I was thinking of giving the blocks just like falling block properties and having them fall like sand would do. But that was a lot harder than I thought, because back then, there wasn't a lot of really easy falling block mechanics. I had to turn each individual block into an entity, and that would take way too long, and I didn't have that kind of time. What I ended up doing was an effect that I would use later on with the destroy blocks, so have that effect that it was mined and dropping particles, and it would have that effect of the bridge collapsing. And then when they fell through and they landed in the trap area, the trap chambers that were set underneath the Monk Temple, that was also an entirely separate world. Just have this whole area that I would dig out underground, and I had pretty much all the space to make any traps that I wanted. Obviously, I had to make them according to the script, but I could make them look any way that I wanted because I wasn't constrained to area. I had a whole world to use.
And it's at this point in the series that we start to see Scourge's progress towards his goal of destroying all of the cities. And we start cutting away to different cities that he's destroyed as he's getting closer and closer to the capital. So that was very interesting, having to essentially take the beautified destruction that Lauren talked about earlier and applying it to a large scale with each of the urban centers of the world, and each one had to kind of get destroyed in a unique way. We had essentially themes planned out for the way each city gets destroyed, where we would focus on Scourge using different types of mobs or different types of methods to tackle each city, and then essentially just film a bunch of mayhem to represent it. So this is also the episode in which Manon makes his sacrifice play. I very deliberately wanted his impulsiveness essentially to be his downfall. Lauren actually set up that room to basically be surrounded with water, and then different blocks would disappear at different times. And I very deliberately wanted to have that long shot closing in closer on Vera as we dolly up to his face. In order to do that while still having the water flowing around and pushing the other characters about, we had to essentially plant his feet in trap doors that would stop the water and allow him to be still while all of this is going on, and it made for actually precisely the right effect I was going for. So episode 9 is the conclusion to what we like to call the Centaurus Noir arc, where we follow the detectives on this case of trying to track down this serial killer. And this case is a very big deal in this world because of the Universal Peace Treaty that you hear the characters reference a couple of times. This, as you might know from World of Edeneth, is essentially the piece of legislation that makes Edeneth so peaceful. Basically, it outlaws all crime very strictly and makes any sort of griefing or murder or theft very illegal and very punishable. In this specific instance, somebody has started murdering people, and it is very different from what they're used to, and so these detectives essentially have to try and track them down. And of course, this allows us to see a lot of the underground of Centaurus, a lot of the shadier corners that we don't normally see. The sequence where the detectives enter the Zealot's lair is actually one that I am very proud of. I essentially wanted to create a sort of psychological thriller vibe about this part, using this very dark environment, this very closed space, and these very archetypal noir characters, and giving it this sort of slow burn suspense feel. And everything from the blocking of the scene to the voice acting, Sarah's did a brilliant performance as Detective Spade, to the music. Stephan Sykora turned out an amazing score for that part that really captured the tension in a very sort of modern neo-noir kind of way. And I absolutely loved the contributions from the people that weren't me that really helped to make that scene as perfect as I thought it was. Now, I shot quite a bit of coverage for this scene, and I initially wanted to cut away to show very clearly what the Zealot is doing outside, but when I saw the POV shot and how atmospheric it was and how well it fit the mood, I decided ultimately to hold on that for the entirety of that scene until the detectives come out. I was worried at first that that would sacrifice some clarity and that the audience wouldn't exactly be able to understand that he was using a redstone torch to open up a secret hole in the wall, but ultimately I felt like A, that point very clearly came across anyway, and B, the atmosphere is well worth the sacrifice.
So there's an interesting story with the Zealot lair. It was one of the earlier things that we built. Once Centaurus was built and we knew that they were going to be going there, I, in the very early production, went and carved out the tunnels and made it look kind of how I thought it would look in the end. Then when we actually started filming, and I saw how the interior of the cave looked when one of our players had gone through and decorated everything, I was like, this looks a lot better than the cave that I made for this Zealot lair. I need to go back and kind of emulate this effect. Also, if you look really closely in the Zealot lair, there's a head in there that should look really familiar.
So the Zealot is actually voiced by the awesome Kielbasa, who also happens to voice Vera in the series. I'm not sure if most people realize that, but he actually had a very fun time with this character. A little bit too much fun playing a crazed Zealot, if you ask me. But he did a fair bit of improv on this character, and some of those lines, particularly that line was entirely improvised. He improvised quite a few things for that character that ended up making it into the final cut, and it was apparently to some pretty comedic effect to a certain extent. So Scourge finding the team out in the wilderness is a very important scene. This is where Eric himself chooses to stay behind due to his injuries. There was quite a few challenges about this. This was also shot on the set world, in fact on the same path that we shot on in episode 3. But this time we destroyed it and modified the environment quite a bit. Wrangling that many zombies was pretty much routine at this point, but we also introduced a giant zombie, which we'd never before worked with. And Lauren had done some tests with the giant zombie prior to production, but by this point, a few updates had gone by and they did not necessarily function the same way. So we had to do quite a few workarounds to get that giant to function properly. For the most part, it was pretty inept and couldn't really function in the same way that any of the other mobs we would control would, but he didn't need to do much, so thankfully he didn't have any speaking lines. That would have been bad.
So when the heroes are running through and they get ambushed by Scourge and they get blown up and Eric is injured and he has to stay back behind, one of our actors who was playing him was like, well, what if we show it? What if we show him injured after the explosion?
We actually have this whole skin where he's battle damaged just for this scene. And that was, again, one of those skins that was just sort of made by one of our skin designers during this process of shooting the scene. It was one of those spontaneous ideas that sort of came about. One of the little details that I was very particular about was that the character's design had to progress. If you look at it, you'll notice that their armor essentially gets peeled away after major incidents. By the end of episode 9, most of the characters didn't really have more armor to continue that progression. And so with Eric, that's where the idea for having a battle damaged Eric skin came in. I was very inspired by Die Hard in the way that the appearance of a character might gradually devolve the longer they're out doing action hero things. That was an important detail to me, and we kept a very specific track of that. Some scenes actually had to go through quite extensive reshoots because we realized that there was a continuity error with some of their outfits. For example, the camp scene at the beginning of episode 9 had to be shot twice. And also there's a pretty spontaneous addition to the camp scene, the scene of Nim bathing as a sort of artsy start to the episode. That wasn't something that was written in the script, but when we saw the location, we decided that we had to do something with this environment. So we did a little bit more set decoration around there, and then had Nim start out in this pool just chilling before going back to the somber moment with the rest of the group.